Thank you. Good afternoon. So, like with the birds, there have been some recent studies about declines in insect populations in certain areas. Some of that's probably to do with climate change, but a lot of it's also to do with human activity, agriculture, increased spraying, and changes in land use. But one group of insects I'm fairly certain is not declining due to climate change are forest pest insects. Not necessarily just the insects that live in the forest, but those insects that are thriving on attacking and breeding in our trees, like the bark beetles that Kevin mentioned. So with climate change, one of the things we're fairly certain about is that we're likely to see more frequent and intense droughts. So what is drought? The answer to that question is pretty simple, okay? But if you're a tree, it's more complicated than that, okay? Because trees respond to a lack of water in different ways depending on where they're growing. And so there's a whole list of these different factors, some more important than others. Some of them won't apply to your area that you're working in. One of the most important ones that's already been discussed a couple times is the temperatures that go along with these droughts. So an excessively hot drought, those record days we've had in Western Washington over 90 degrees in recent years, the number of those days increasing, that draws a lot more water out of these plant leaves, okay? So that water has to be replaced somehow. The season of the drought, again, Kevin mentioned this, the lack of water in the summer or the growing season is much more important than lack of water at other times of the year. The duration, how long does that drought period last? Is it 3 or 4 months over the summer with zero rain, which we've seen a couple times with 3 months without rain? That's hard for these trees to endure that. And how many years? That cumulative effect that has been talked about. Type of soil is obviously very important. What tree species you've got, their different drought tolerance levels, the size of the tree. So the smaller trees at the early stages in these droughts are going to be much more affected than the bigger trees. The smaller ones more likely to die outright from the drought. And those with shallow root systems, of course, are going to have less access to water. Also kind of related to temperature is the amount of wind in the area and what time of year that wind is coming through. Is it a hot, dry wind? And if it is, it could be desiccating those leaves, pulling the water out even faster than just temperature alone. Of course, competition, and then where are your trees growing, right? If they're on a ridge or a south-facing slope, they're going to be a lot more stressed from these drought events as opposed to being on a north-facing slope or down in a gully. And then the position in the tree's range. So that's not just, from California to BC where these trees grow, but also the range in elevation. So are you lower down in that elevation range? Is your Douglas-fir growing alongside oaks or pines? So that can be really important because a lot of these effects are more severe on the fringe of these stands. And then the last one here that I'm going to talk most about is the presence of these insects and pathogens that can take advantage of this drought stress. So they're always out there in some small number, but the question becomes, when you have cumulative droughts year after year, are you actually building up higher populations of these things in the area? And then they can have even more of an advantage. So this list, if you want to try to do something about climate change effects on the trees, there are some things in here that you have control over, and Kevin hinted at those. So if there's a management option, it would be contained within this. Some of the other things I'm going to talk about later, we don't necessarily have a lot of control over, or we don't really even understand well how the insects are going to respond to the changing climate. We're trying to do more research in that area, but again, with trees and forest insect pests that may only have an outbreak every decade or so, it's hard to perform that research in a real world setting. So this is 20 years of drought monitor data from the state of Washington from 2001 through where we are right now in 2019. The yellow color is abnormally dry. The next color, darker, is moderate drought. Then we have severe being orange and extreme, the red. Exceptional drought, not showing up anywhere in Washington in the last 20 years. That might be a California thing. But that may change. But if you notice on this chart, we get these droughts, or at least abnormally dry, moderate droughts, pretty much every year, and they usually occur in the summertime. So these dates are January, so between the two dates is the summer season. So here's a 2017 drought, and the size of this bar is showing the percentage of the state affected. So if that color goes all the way to the top of the graph, it means that 100% of the state was in some level of drought condition. So 2015 was really quite exceptional with, I'm sorry, I shouldn't use the word exceptional, it was extreme, mostly red here, and you can see a picture of that from summer 2015 at the bottom, including the west side was under that extreme drought. And our trees are adapted to summer drought. It occurs every year. If it's short and the temperatures aren't too high, they have ways of getting around that, and only the weaker trees tend to die or be severely damaged. But when you get the cumulative effect, like Kevin was talking about since 2012, this buildup, it starts to have a real serious impact on those larger, more mature trees with the deeper root systems that are more established, and they're going to have a harder time. So we're setting up this scenario where we have normal drought versus what we're calling, or I'm calling, hotter droughts. I didn't invent that term. That came from this study from 2015, Temperate Forest Health in an Era of Emerging Mega Disturbance. So hotter drought. I'll say what that means in a minute, but the first bullet there, so droughts are natural, okay, we talked about that. Most trees are adapted. Normal droughts have limited landscape effects, so they don't, you saw from those maps, they don't affect every area of the state. And they tend to pick off those younger, weaker trees with smaller root systems. Then we have the severe droughts like 2015. Those can cause much more widespread damage, all right? And you can start to see after effects of that, more insect activity and outbreaks that might come out of that. There's an incredible amount of dead material out there that these beetles can breed in from the severe droughts, and we have a lot more fuel for fires. So, but if that just occurs in a single year, the cumulative effect is minimized. Now, when we get in with climate change, we're experiencing more frequent and intense droughts, so they're referring to these as the hotter droughts. So not only do they last longer, but the temperatures are higher. And so the cumulative effect really starts to have an impact. And those hotter droughts, now we're starting to see the potential for significant landscape changes. So not a few of my trees have died and it's part of the normal ecosystem. Now we're starting to see wider areas with these impacts, especially in places with droughtier soils. So some quotes from another study. This is long-term climate and competition. Explain forest mortality patterns under extreme drought. And the quotes are, rising temperatures are amplifying the drought-induced stress and mortality that we're seeing. So it's adding on top. And then the drought-induced mortality may increase at the hot, dry limit of individual tree species range. So that's what I was talking about, these trees growing on the edge of their distribution. And that edge, over the next decades, may start moving further in as these susceptible trees start to die along the edge. All right, so drought being one of the biggest impacts that we have from climate change on trees. Like Kevin mentioned, you can have direct damage just from drought alone. So more than one species is often affected. Here you see in pines and Douglas-fir. on the same stand, so worse on those marginal sites, well-drained rocky soils, and you have the damage kind of from the top down and the outside in. So those more tender leaves are the first to be affected. And sometimes you might see this damage close up on a tree of reduced length of shoots or the size of needles because they have limited resources, and then actual wilting, kind of a bleaching color where they're losing their chlorophyll. You see a branch like this is kind of brown and green. There are a lot of things that could cause that, like the fall foliage that Kevin was talking about, but could also be foliar pathogens that caused by fungi. And so look closely at this stuff, and if you don't see the little black fruiting bodies or discoloration, banding patterns, if it's just brown, then you might suspect some kind of non-biological thing like drought. Another thing that we're seeing a lot are these sunken bark cankers. It's kind of like a sun scorch on the bark, and that tends to be much worse in smaller reproduction sized trees that already have thinner bark. And so that in itself can be enough to kill a tree if it girdles that whole stem. But you could also get fungi that can get in that dead cambium and grow into other parts of the tree, and beetles can attack there as well. Lots of stressed cone crops, dead tops, flagging, stuff that Kevin talked about. So from the road or looking at your trees from a trail, you might suspect these drought symptoms. But it's kind of like looking for root disease. If you have a bark beetle problem, you should really try to look for root disease to see if there's some underlying cause. So like with drought, where possible, it's a good idea to look for evidence of insect activity. And unfortunately for most of the trees that I look at, you're just looking at eye level. And so you're looking at that main stem, the widest part of the tree. And in this case, in a Douglas-fir, there's nothing in there. So the tree is completely dead. The cambium was still wet on the surface of the sapwood here. So no beetle boring galleries. So what are you to make of that? Well, the next thing, if you could do it, would be to cut down the tree and look at what's going on up in here in the top, where Kevin talked about that broken water column. So again, if you cut the tree down, you might see the same thing and know that it's just drought. But it might also be filled with beetles. And so some examples, mostly smaller trees. Here's the western red cedars and the Douglas-fir. Smaller trees going out, topkill and a ponderosa pine, and then the western hemlock, where not necessarily just the lower needles are gone, like with that Rhizoctonia, but we're seeing a lot of western hemlock mortality recently that we're tying back to drought being a kind of predisposing factor. And the problem with the hemlocks is when they die like that, they don't hold on to their needles. And so any red or brown color that might catch your attention, or when we're doing surveys and mapping dead trees, a lot of this hemlock mortality gets overlooked. Yes?
Is there a species difference based on the taproot? The hemlocks don't have much taproot, the firs do. Does that make a difference in some of this drought die-off?
Well, I'm not an expert in that area, but I would think it would, because the hemlocks are less drought tolerant than the Douglas-fir. And I don't know how much of that has to do with the size of their root systems. The hemlock's very shallow, right? So we're seeing, I think initially we saw differences in what trees were going out as this kind of played out. Again, starting around 2012, it was the Douglas-fir with the top kill and the branch flagging, and then we started getting more reports of the hemlock and the pines, and now it's the cedars. And it doesn't necessarily make sense from a drought tolerance standpoint, so it's kind of interesting. But down here at the bottom, I put this note that any one of these trees in these pictures could contain the secondary bark beetles that Kevin introduced you to. So these are opportunists. And what they're doing on a normal year is breeding in dead material. So in slash piles, branches broken from the weather, this small diameter stuff, these secondary beetles tend to be much smaller than their larger cousins that actually aggressively attack and kill trees like mountain pine beetle or Douglas-fir beetle. So they stay at low populations in this slash broken material. They infest the small diameter suppressed or weakened trees, and so they're providing an important ecosystem service by weeding out these weaker trees and starting the process of decay and recycling. So they're not bad and acting as a thinning agent in a way. But then when we have these big events, especially on the west side with drought, you start to have a lot more fresh breeding material for them to go into, and they can actually build up populations. So they're not only taking advantage of weak trees, but then the next year you have more of them. And again, they're not really aggressive, and so if the drought is a single year, that big buildup of these beetles is typically going to go away, or they're going to go back into this material that's already dead on the ground and stay low, or attacking root disease trees. But if you get year after year of drought, you can continue to build that beetle population. And so they can certainly be an add-on effect, even though we're calling them secondary. They wouldn't be killing trees if you hadn't had the drought or what other underlying cause first, but they're certainly adding to the number of dead trees that we're seeing out there. So in Douglas-fir, you have 3 different important species that we're seeing in there. They make a tiny little gallery, so this is like a 6-inch diameter stem here, and this long straight tunnel or gallery is made by the adult female laying eggs, and then branching off from there are the larvae that are feeding on the phloem or sugars, and they're the ones that are doing all the damage and cutting off the flow of that sugar and killing this tree. So anytime you see a straight line with perpendicular tunnels going off to the side, that's going to be a bark beetle. And so again, you could be looking at some of these drought-stressed trees and find those galleries. The length of that female egg gallery in this Douglas-fir pole beetle and Douglas-fir engraver is going to be really short, just a couple inches to maybe 6 inches long, whereas Douglas-fir beetle, the gallery is going to be much bigger, closer to 9 inches to a foot and a half long. So they're usually not a problem until you have these disturbances. Another one that's considered secondary in eastern Washington, we have this on the west side as well, but it's definitely only a secondary on the west side. But I have been seeing increases of it killing drought-stressed shore pine or lodgepole. On the east side, these little beetles have multiple generations per year, so they can go from egg to adult in as little as 8 weeks. And in Washington, we have 2 generations of them, so they can really quickly build up in storm damage, logging slash. Again, this is just pine that we're talking about here, not firs. And so occasionally we have these outbreaks where it switches from being a secondary in that stress stuff or the dead slash on the ground to actually aggressively killing nearby pine trees. So it can be a real problem. The outbreaks usually only last 1 year because a lot of them die over the winter. They don't protect themselves very well. They hang out in the duff, in the needles on the ground, or under these bark plates or what have you, and so they're vulnerable to cold temperatures. And then there's less of this slash or new storm damage unless you have another event every year. So they don't last very long, and then we see a lot more mortality of standing nearby trees if you have a drought, because those nearby trees are stressed, so they're bigger targets. Other secondary bark beetles, pretty much any dead conifer that is dying from root disease or drought. If you look hard enough, you can find galleries of these little beetles. Here's one that goes across, an egg gallery that goes across the grain, parallel to the ground. That's a silver fir beetle that prefers silver fir, but also attacks hemlocks. And also in western hemlock, we have hemlock engraver. That should not be, I should say hemlock engraver there. Again, not primary. These things do not kill trees by themselves. So you have to have some underlying cause. And then in western red cedar, the genus Foliar or cedar bark beetles, look for these tiny little exit holes. So not the sapsucker size, but like the size of a BB, just a few millimeters across. And if you see those holes, that means the new adults, they've been successful and come out. And so that tree's already been killed, and there's no need to kind of sanitize that tree or remove it or burn it to get rid of these beetles because they've already come out. And then here's a beetle in noble fir, Pityoctones, which makes multiple branched egg galleries. And there's Pityopterus in pines. We refer to these as the itty bitty pitties because they are really tiny beetles, like the point of a pencil, and they're very difficult to identify. But so if you see those galleries in your trees, don't always think that you've got a primary bark beetle problem. So this picture I showed you earlier where there's nothing in the main stem, this is a perfectly good Douglas-fir, and we have lots of Douglas-fir beetle that love to attack trees of this size. So why aren't there any beetles in here? And one experiment they did, this is not with Douglas-fir, and it's not even in North America, this is from Europe, looking at a European spruce bark beetle. And so they actually took spruce trees, which were the main host, and put tents over them to simulate severe drought. And then in the experiment, of course, they had trees where they didn't tent at all, got normal water, and then some that they tented half the time. So they got a moderate drought. And then they put lures, like a pheromone that attracts these beetles on these trees, and watched what happened. And basically what they noticed was that the healthy trees that were getting normal water, well, they weren't attacked, right? Because of the pitch pushing those beetles out, a normal defense response. And then those trees that the beetles really liked were the ones that were moderately drought stressed, because the defenses have been compromised. Some of the beetles can get in and be successful, but then there's still enough juice, so to speak, in that tree, enough of the nice sugars that they want to feed on. Whereas these trees that are extremely drought stressed, they may not even be attractive to these beetles. I mean, they could be attractive, the beetles may arrive, but when they kind of sample under the bark, the females may not lay their eggs in there because they know, or as much as an insect can know something, that their little juicy succulent larvae aren't going to do so well in this dried out tree. So that's what they're looking for. I mean, of course, they prefer trees that are completely dead from something like a windstorm or fire damage, where that sugar is still intact but not defended. That's their favorite host. But if they can't get that, then they're going to try to get in these trees that have less resin for pitch response, less resin and toxic compounds that might kill the beetle brood. We do have some major bark beetle species, so these are not secondary, that in years outside of drought, we have plenty of mortality from these species. They like to hang out in stress trees from things like root disease. They like to hang out in wind-thrown trees or fire damaged trees. And as long as there's not too much of that stuff, then they stay low. But if you get a big disturbance, you can have outbreaks of these. In this fir engraver, Scolitis, this is another one that makes this egg gallery that goes across the grain like this with the larvae going up and down. The main host around here is going to be grand fir, but noble also, really any true fir can be a host of fir engraver. This is Ellensburg 2016, not a big surprise to see some fir engraver mortality following drought, but now we're really seeing a lot of this fir engraver, grand fir mortality on the west side. It's really picked up in the last few years. And so if you look at It's a busy graph, but it's again, this is the 2 decades of drought monitor that I showed you earlier, and then just matching up the years from our aerial survey that we do every year. We map these red trees show up pretty well from an airplane, and so we put them on a map and total up the acres that have that type of damage. And you can see a pattern where you have these longer, more severe drought events, more cumulative effect, and then you see an uptick in the number of acres affected by these beetles. And you get another one here and another uptick, and there's usually a couple year, 2 to 3 year delay to see that damage on the ground. And didn't get as much of a response here as I would have expected, but it is ticking up. And 2019, we haven't finished the survey yet, but the number is going to be really high this year, I can tell you. Another one that's on the east side is the western pine beetle in Ponderosa. Very similar pattern to the fir engraver in being linked to drought. Here we are again in 2016, south of Spokane, these big groups of Ponderosa being killed by this pretty aggressive bark beetle that always becomes more successful following drought. So same kind of pattern as the fir engraver. You can see those 3 peaks that I showed you with the fir engraver are also happening with western pine beetle. And this one's going up as well again this year. So I mentioned those 2, the fir engraver and the western pine beetle, that are linked to drought. We do have these other bark beetles, so just keep in mind it's not all about drought. And they are primary tree killers, and there are lots of other factors that can lead to outbreaks that are really destructive that have nothing to do with drought. So burn trees, of course, are a good food source if they're not completely torched, and there's still some good sugars in there for the bark beetles. We can see outbreaks of Douglas-fir beetle, mountain pine beetle, related to fires, more so Douglas-fir beetle. Windstorms are a big factor for Douglas-fir beetle on the west side, creating a lot of breeding material all at once. And then for mountain pine beetle, the one you saw the picture of with, in the bird talk with the sea of red trees, that one is much more related to over-mature stands or overstocked stands. In that case, lodgepole, where the trees are stressed from competition and they're much bigger than much bigger than they have space to grow. And so those bark beetle outbreaks can get going just as a result of the competition stress. And once they get going, they can just keep trucking along. We also have wood borers that are related to drought. So you've probably seen these things in the woods. There's 3 different families of wood boring insects, much bigger than the bark beetles. So you've got the metallic wood borer, kind of shiny green or bronze color, makes an oval-shaped exit hole. The longhorn wood borers with the long antennae, and they make a round exit hole. And then the wood wasps, and they all have these larvae that are doing similar things. You've seen those holes in your firewood. In fact, all of these that we have in our trees are native, and they're all, for the most part, with one exception, attacking trees that are already dead or dying. And so again, they're kind of good guys helping the recycling process. So here's a difference between what those wood borer larvae look like under the bark. Much longer, much more random tunneling, and the bark beetles are really like a size of a grain of rice with a C-shaped body, and they make these parallel tunnels, not so random. There is one called the flatheaded fir borer that's one of these metallic wood borers that's actually causing a lot of, as a primary tree killer, again, it gets much worse with drought, in southwest Oregon, killing Douglas-fir down there. And we have this beetle up here, and I've seen some examples of green Douglas-fir trees. So foliage is still green, and you look inside, you see evidence of beetles in this tree, the frass or boring dust, and you're expecting to see Douglas-fir beetle, and instead you see these wood borers. Well, if the tree is still green, that's telling me that these wood borers are taking on a much more aggressive stance than just coming in after a tree has already died. So of course that tree was probably under some kind of extreme stress. And here's the part I mentioned that I would say about root diseases and canker fungi. So here's an example of a canker in a stem and root disease that's decaying wood, sapwood. And the normal response of a healthy tree is to try to wall those things off. So if you get cut, you're going to bleed, and that blood is flushing out the bacteria. Well, the tree has the same response to fungi, flushing that area. That takes a lot of water and pitch to continually flush that out. And then once that's done, they can create kind of a wall or a zone line where they're trying to compartmentalize. So this part of my tissue is infected, you know, almost like a scab in a way. I'm going to wall that off so it doesn't proceed further and become lethal. And so trees that are under stress, they don't have enough resources to mount this defense. And so it's kind of counterintuitive, because you think, oh, root diseases, fungi under the soil, wet soils, it's going to be worse, right? Well, actually, if the soils get really dry and the tree is drought stressed, you can see more effective root disease. And they also may have, when they're stressed, they're producing a lot more nitrogen and sugar, or not necessarily producing more, sorry, they're concentrating it in a smaller area. So they have less of it in smaller area. And so that is an easier target as a food source for this root disease, which is essentially a parasite, right, to get to that stuff. So yes, we do see more effect with droughts and fungi, and then also these stressed trees can shed their foliage more quickly if the drought is upon them. Sometimes we refer to these things called declines, and so it's not any specific damage agent like a bark beetle or root disease. It's not necessarily just drought. It tends to be a combination of all those things. And this, I'll show a better picture of this, but this is called the Mannion spiral, also known as the death spiral. And on the outside, you have these predisposing factors that that will start the decline. Then they follow by an inciting factor, which is usually some kind of event like a drought. And then the contributing factor at the end of the spiral here, as they're going down the toilet bowl, is usually some kind of biological thing like a fungi or a beetle or a bacteria. Okay, and so you can get combinations of these things. And so what we're talking about here today, climate change, low soil moisture holding capacity, outside their climatic adapted range, those are all predisposing factors on the first level. Then you have the inciting factor, which is a drought event. Get several of those, this can really compound. And then that's when our insects and fungi come in to contribute to the actual mortality of these trees. So as somebody said in one of their PhD defense talks to a question they didn't know the answer to, it's a complicated interaction of abiotic and biotic factors. Okay, and somehow that one got by. So here's an example of a decline that we've seen a lot of in Western Washington with the bigleaf maple. Over the last decade now, it seems like, about 2010, first reports are coming in with crown dieback in maple, discolored leaves, reduced leaf size. And these effects, you know, with deciduous trees, you kind of expect them to recover and come back from this. But a lot of them weren't. And so DNR and other groups did some investigations, put in some plots, took samples to look for a kind of a smoking gun. You know, was there some root disease like anthracnose or verticillium wilt? Was there bark beetles? Was there little sap-sucking insects that were doing this to the leaves? And, you know, there was some of all of those things, but not everywhere. And so it wasn't one thing you could point to. And then the University of Washington had a grad student put in some study plots, and at the end of this, basically correlated this kind of damage with higher summer temperatures, more frequent and extreme drought, and human activity. So maples growing near urban areas. Defoliating insects. again, this is kind of like root disease. You don't think right away, hey, a caterpillar that chews on leaves is going to do better after a drought. It doesn't make a lot of sense. But again, like with the root disease, you have a higher concentration in the needles of the nitrogen and the sugars that they need too. And so they have to eat less to grow bigger. So western spruce budworm and Douglas-fir tussock moth are both east side defoliators that cause a lot of damage to the grand fir, Doug fir over there. But we also have those insects in western Washington. But we don't see the outbreaks and the damage over here, and that is probably due to the fact that we have, our trees have more access to moisture. So the needles are bigger and they're not quite as nutritious. So there is evidence that the western spruce budworm outbreaks after these drought periods. Douglas-fir tussock moth tends to be more successful in these fringe trees, like these Doug fir kind of growing out near the sagebrush area where it's quite a bit drier. Sucking insects, so these are sap feeders, the aphids, scale insects. There are lots of different pests in this group that affect conifer trees and hardwood trees. And since they're sucking sap, when we have wet years, they're always more successful, right? And so you get more aphids, but the trees are usually able to recover pretty quickly because the aphids also have a lot of natural enemies, like parasites and predators that knock the population down and trees come back, okay? But if we have a severe drought, a drought that came before these sap-sucking insects had their outbreak, then we can see mortality. And it's not mortality from the aphids or the scale insect, it's typically the drought, and then these scale insects kind of pushed them over the top. So here in oak, we have an oak pit scale, actually seeing mortality from something that ordinarily would not kill an oak tree, but it's in a very droughty site out here all by itself. And now this year we've got a spruce aphid outbreak on the coast in the Sitka spruce, and usually it just damages the old foliage of these trees and leaves the buds alone. But some of these trees are so stressed from drought that they're actually dying from this damage. And then foliar disease, Kevin kind of hinted at this, the new foliar diseases that are showing up, like the rhizoctonia that he talked about in the hemlock. And here's another example, of Phytophthora in Douglas-fir. And so these may have already been on the landscape, but now they're becoming much more important, kind of like the secondary bark beetles, in showing up and doing more damage. We will also see greater incidence of these foliar diseases with changing weather patterns, right? So they need the moisture in the spring or fall, depending on which fungus you're talking about, to do well. And with climate change, it's expected that we'll see more rainfall at different periods of the year that we're not expecting. And then again, drought stress is going to cause them to drop more needles. So you're going to notice these foliar diseases more, and some people are calling them kind of like the canary in the coal mine, so to speak. So just real quick, because I'm running out of time, but I emphasize potential here because we don't really know how this is going to play out. But some of the things to think about is the timing of when the host breaks bud, and you have these little caterpillars that are going to feed on that new foliage. Well, they have to be there at the right time. And here's a little budworm caterpillar that will actually mine into a bud of a fir tree that hasn't even opened yet. And so timing is really critical for that little caterpillar to be successful. And a few weeks shift in early spring or late spring isn't going to necessarily set them off. But when we get wider shifts, we just don't know what will happen. And that might be the one good news story with climate change, right? If one of these defoliating caterpillars suddenly can't get its food and do its damage. Of course, the natural enemies that attack these caterpillars may also shift, and that would be bad. I mentioned rainfall with foliar disease already, shifting rainfall patterns. Warmer winters, okay, there's kind of a misnomer with bark beetles that if we have warm winters, they're going to do better. If we have really cold winters, it's going to kill all the bark beetles. When in fact, they actually have natural antifreeze in their bodies that they build up in the fall, and then they spend the winter literally hibernating, and they can go down to like 40 below and still come out in the spring. And a lot of insects, their hibernating form, whether it's an egg or an adult that's filled with antifreeze, are very resistant to those winter temperatures. They're adapted to that. But some that are actually exposed or active during the winter, like those aphids I mentioned in the spruce, they're actually feeding in the winter. And so when we have a nice, I'm sorry, not nice, an exceptionally warm winter, that's nice for some people, okay? But it really allows these insects to take off and grow much faster than and survive better than they would otherwise. One thing though with cold weather though that you would be usually right to talk about is these late spring frosts or cold snaps in the spring. When those bark beetles are active, the antifreeze isn't really a factor anymore, the little caterpillars out feeding, they're exposed, and you get that spring freeze. That can really knock back these populations. And so if we start seeing less of this kind of thing with a warming climate, then obviously that's advantage bugs, right? And then, as was mentioned in the bird talk, you got a warmer season, a longer season, they can do more damage. They can reproduce faster. So if they have a real short generation time, like that Ips beetle at 8 weeks, when you get down to California, they have 5 generations per summer down there. All right. So here in Washington, we could easily see the 2 switch to a 3, and you can see how that might be bad. Okay. And then they can move up, so up to higher elevations than they'd ever been able to get to before, and they can move farther north. Again, this is what the birds are doing, right? But with insects, they may be encountering new host trees. Like with mountain pine beetle in this case, there's a new species that they've never attacked before called jack pine. Over here, this is mostly lodgepole. If they get into the jack pine, who knows, right? Because jack pine does not have any natural evolved defense against mountain pine beetle. So they can encounter these new trees that they've never attacked before, and it's really an unknown how that's going to pan out. All right, and then